With the rather dread approach of winter, I feel it appropriate to begin our discussion of ballet history with the Nutcracker. Between shrinking government grants, decrepit and dying donor bases, as well as mounting overhead expenses, the Nutcracker is always a much anticipated source of financial respite for American ballet companies. Arguably, of all the classical ballets, it is the one to have most successfully, in America at least, invaded the public consciousness. It is one of the most popular classical ballets and, interestingly, one of the least standardized. Every year, across thousands of communities in the United States alone, professional dance companies, conservatories, dance schools, college programs, and even high school programs present, with varying degrees of competence and success, performances of a ballet called the Nutcracker. Indeed, the sheer volume of performances is matched by an equally inexhaustible diversity of productions. Of the many canonically accepted versions, some of the most notable are Balanchine's 1954 production for New York City Ballet, Yuri Grigorovich's 1966 production for Bolshoi, Vasily Vainonen's 1934 version for the Kirov, now Mariinsky Ballet, and Peter Wright's production for the Royal Ballet. There are additionally numerous major and regional productions, to say nothing of the many contemporary reimaginings and restagings. From Mark Morris's Hard Nut to Matthew Boyne's kaleidoscopic Nutcracker with exclamation point, or even Marius Béjart's surreal autobiographical fantasy Nutcracker. The cultural reach and scope of the Nutcracker is of course too broad and extensive to address in the course of a listenable episode. As such, I intend to restrict the scope of the survey to the first 1892 production, a collaboration between Tchaikovsky, Petipa, Lev Ivanov, and director of the Imperial Theater's Ivan Wisłowski. I'll be drawing heavily on the work of musicologist Roland John Wiley and his book, Tchaikovsky's Ballets, in addition to several other sources. A full list of citations will be available in the transcript, as well as links to relevant material, including this book, which is available for purchase and is considered a seminal work on 19th century ballet. For the sake of brevity, I will focus in this episode on the troubled creation of the ballet and the peculiar character of its choreographer, Lev Ivanov. In the forthcoming episode, I will deal with the choreography and critical reception of the first production, which I hope you will join me for next week. Part 1. The creation of the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker premiered in 1892 at the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg. In the late 19th century, Russia enjoyed a somewhat unusual relationship with ballet compared to Western Europe. Ballet in the West, with the notable exception of Denmark, had gone into a steady decline since the 1830s. By the second half of the 19th century, it was viewed as a popular entertainment with only decorative value, for which almost no serious critical attention was expended. In Russia, however, ballet enjoyed the special patronage of the Tsar. The theater school facilities, the salary of its faculty, sets, costumes, and the collected cost of production were defrayed by the resources of the imperial privy purse. In Russia, the theater was a highly bureaucratic institution. The director of the imperial theaters was a government functionary appointed by the Tsar himself. This patronage also conferred a measure of respect on the art form. There was a highly developed critical atmosphere in Petersburg. Ballet was treated as a serious art. The composition and performance elements of ballet were discussed with a level of attention, competence, and authority not to be found anywhere outside of Russia. It should be noted that this unusual relationship gave the Tsar's government a large measure of control over what works were presented. The director of the imperial theaters was a powerful post that oversaw all elements of production and worked out the collaborative elements for each. He reported directly to the Tsar and to relevant members of the theater-going aristocracy. He represented the Tsar's interests on stage, all while managing the Byzantine intrigues of conniving bureaucrats and temperamental artists. In 1881, Ivan Wisłowski was appointed to the post of director of the imperial theaters. He was not only a privileged member of the aristocracy with close ties to the higher circles of Russian nobility, but also a man of rare energy, intelligence, and culture. While his detractors were often apt to cast him as a plodding dilettante, his unusually long tenure from 1881 to 1898 saw the unprecedented growth of ballet as an art form, along with numerous structural improvements to bureaucracy and payroll in the Mariinsky. Wisłowski is most widely remembered today as the one responsible for bringing Tchaikovsky back into the composition of ballets after the fizzled first production of Swan Lake in 1877. In 1890, 2 years before the premiere of The Nutcracker, Wisłowski oversaw the production of Sleeping Beauty. It was a highly successful collaboration between Tchaikovsky and the choreographer slash balletmaster-in-chief of the Marinsky, Marius Petipa, for which Veslovsky himself also designed the costumes and wrote the libretto. Following this success, he sought to effect another collaboration, one for the next 1891 to 1892 season. Tchaikovsky was to compose a one-act opera, Iolanthe, based on Heinrich Hertz's play King René's Daughter, and a two-act ballet based on another children's story, Alexander Dumas' French adaptation of E.T.A. Hoffmann's The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. From start to finish, The Nutcracker was plagued by problems. Structural problems, libretto problems, musical problems, choreographic problems, personal tragedy, illness, and press troubles, culminating in a suitably icy public reception. The libretto, which Roland John Wiley alleges was largely the work of Veslovsky himself, was the source of the greatest dissatisfaction between the individual collaborators. Both Petipa and Tchaikovsky were piqued by the layout of the ballet, which consisted of a first act overladen with pantomime that fed into a static second act with little dramatic or formal justification. Another issue was practical, fatigue. From both Petipa and Tchaikovsky, neither had had much rest after the success of Sleeping Beauty. In a letter to Veslovsky, Tchaikovsky details Petipa's concerns. On the day of my departure from Petersburg, I passed about an hour and a half in conversation with Marius Petipa in connection with Casse-Noisette. Having completed the discussion about business, he moved on to a detailed review of his present activities in the theater. As far as I could make out, he brought up the subject with the purpose of drawing your attention indirectly, that is, through me, to the fact that he is very fatigued by the last season, that very much lies before him in future, and as a consequence, he needs to rest and refresh himself with a trip abroad. I asked him if he wanted me to bring what he had told me to your attention in a letter. He responded in the affirmative, and so I'm fulfilling his wish. To me, Petipa is most likable in all respects, and it is with the greatest of pleasure that I petition you on his behalf. If this petition is out of place and tactless, then for God's sake forgive me. But if it is possible to indulge this most kind old man, then, dear Ivan Alexandrovich, be good enough to help him in this. Tchaikovsky himself was exhausted by the previous season, in which he had composed not only the four-act Sleeping Beauty, but also the three-act opera Queen of Spades. The necessity of composing another opera and ballet was further complicated by a demanding touring schedule. He writes to Veslovsky of the impossibility of completing an opera and ballet for the 1891-1892 season. Quote, "For some time, the prospect of urgent, wearisome work has begun to frighten me. Here, in Rouen, I had to call on extraordinary willpower to make an agonizing effort in order to work. As a result, what comes out is colorless, dry, hasty, and wretched. The awareness that things are not going well torments me and agonizes me to tears, to the point of sickness. A consuming depression constantly gnaws at my heart, and I have not for a long time felt as unhappy as now. I want to keep my word, for at a last meeting it seems that I positively gave my word to perform the work I agreed to do in the allotted time. And at the same time, I am deeply convinced that nothing good will come out of all of my excessive efforts, either for the theater or for me. As always happens with very nervous and impressionable people with unbalanced natures whose wounds are easily reopened, everything which is now worrying and troubling took on monstrous proportions for me, turned into some kind of feverish nightmare which gives me neither peace, day nor night. Casse-Noisette, the daughter of King René, these images do not gladden me. They do not excite inspiration, but frighten, horrify, and pursue me, waking and sleeping, mocking me with the thought that I shall not cope with them. Finally, for God's sakes, do not laugh, for I am completely serious. For the last 3 days, I've been simply sick from despair, fright, and the most evil melancholy. In the night, I suddenly decided that things cannot continue thus, and that I must grieve you by the refusal to keep my word. Dear Ivan Alexandrovich, I love you very much and can't stand it when you're angry with me, but I assure you I just don't have the strength. Nevertheless, I imagine that it is better for me to notify you in advance of the impossibility of writing an opera and ballet in time for next season, so that you can give instructions about exchanging them with something else in good time." End quote. The day after Tchaikovsky wrote this thoroughly bleak letter, he read an announcement on April 16th that his sister Alexandra had died. In view of these circumstances, Veslovsky relented, and in the following letter agrees to postpone the ballet and opera for the following season. Quote, Better for us to wait a year than to require you to write and compose operas and ballets without any inspiration and pleasure. Although the stage designs for Casse-Noisette are already ordered, the decor could also be painted for the season of 1892-1893. Only do not completely give up the task at hand. This is my most earnest entreaty to you." End quote. The Nutcracker was to be postponed another year to premiere in 1892. Besides the obvious fatigue of the composer and choreographer, the question emerges: what was so difficult to work with in this libretto? What exactly was the story detailed in this libretto, and why was it so unsatisfactory? We'll start first with the layout of the original plot before we delve into its problems. The first act begins with the parents of Clara and Fritz Silberhaus decorating a Christmas tree with assorted guests. This completed, the children are then called for gifts. This ceremony is then interrupted by the mysterious entrance of the counselor Drosselmeyer, to the general consternation of the children. He then brings extravagant gifts for his godchildren, which he demonstrates to the general delight. Claire and Fritz are disappointed when these toys are retired, but Drosselmeyer has another toy up his sleeve, a Nutcracker. Claire is drawn to it and dismayed when she is made to share it with Fritz, who subsequently breaks it. The party comes to an end and the children are sent to bed. Silence ensues. Claire comes down to check the Nutcracker and is scared by the sound of mice. Midnight strikes and the frightening image of Drosselmeyer appears on the face of the clock. Quote, "The Christmas tree grows to an enormous height and the dolls come alive." End quote. A battle ensues between the toys and the mice. The toys are defeated and the Nutcracker enters into combat with the Mouse King. He is almost defeated until Claire hurls a slipper at the Mouse King and the tide is turned. The mice are routed. Victory goes to the Nutcracker. None dare contest the supremacy of her all-smiting shoe. The Nutcracker turns into a prince and leads Clara through a winter forest. The second tableau of Act 1 depicts a snowstorm, and Act 1 is concluded. Act 2 occurs in Konfiturenburg, land of the sweets. Quote, "The inhabitants and their sovereign, the Sugar Plum Fairy, await Clara and the Nutcracker." End quote. When both arrive, the Nutcracker presents Clara to his sisters. A grand divertissement and pas de deux between the Sugar Plum Fairy and Prince Coqueluche, quite literally Prince Darling, ensues. The Nutcracker, in order to oblige Clara in her wish not to wake from what appears to be her dream, tells her of the, quote, "fairy tale wonders and unusual customs of Konfiturenburg." The ballet ends with an apotheosis in which a beehive is depicted. Speaking purely in terms of plot, many versions of the Nutcracker as presented today still retain much of the first act as set down in the original libretto. As for the second act, no modern stagings really retain this beehive apotheosis, though in the Radmansky staging there is some slight nod to this in his Waltz of the Flowers. Most performances today opt instead to conclude the ballet with a sort of dream awakening scene for Clara. As for the deficiencies of this libretto, I turn to the analysis of Wiley. This story, while quaint, offers little promise for good theater. It has obvious structural defects. An action-filled Act 1 is followed by an almost static Act 2. In addition, the librettist of Nutcracker lost the satisfactory merging of the fantastic and everyday worlds which E.T.A. Hoffmann had taken pains to create in his prose. While the second act of the ballet may be a logical progression from the magical events which take place beneath the Christmas tree in Act 1, those magical events lack compelling motivation. The change from the everyday to the fantastic world also happens subtly, without the opportunity for reflection that the act divisions provide in Swan Lake. The crisis precipitated by the Mouse King and his army is not justified in the context of Claire's everyday existence. And we are given no clue to the Nutcracker's prior existence as an adamant being. Because Clara never returns to everyday existence from Konfiturenburg, the audience is left at the final curtain asking what the point of the piece was, and what more it must know for the story to make sense. Above all, the Nutcracker loses the element of relation to human experience that Sleeping Beauty gained in the process of adaptation from story to ballet. As a result, Nutcracker remains a simple children's tale, without significance as an allegory or parable. It is precisely what some critics falsely accuse Sleeping Beauty of being. End quote. As I mentioned earlier, the limitations of this libretto proved likewise troubling for Petipa, who got as far as drafting a choreographic plan for this ballet. before withdrawing and leaving the task of composition to his second-in-command, Lev Ivanov. It was Ivanov, not Petipa, who would ultimately be responsible for the choreography of the first production. While someone suggested that this withdrawal might have been a tactical sort of withdrawal from a lost cause, in Nadine Meisner's comprehensive biography of Petipa, Marius Petipa, the Emperor's Balletmaster, several legitimate reasons are offered for Petipa's abandonment of the project. For one, Petipa was, like Tchaikovsky, fatigued. After Sleeping Beauty, he had, without holiday, staged 2 new ballets, in addition to a revival of his 1868 success, Le Roi Condul. At the beginning of 1892, Petipa was still busy. He had staged another revival of La Sylphide, and another ballet in February for the examinations of the Imperial Theatre School, to say nothing of his additional duties as Balletmaster-in-Chief, i.e. as teacher and rehearsal director. In the months approaching the rehearsals for Nutcracker, his daughter, Evgenia, died at age 15 after a botched leg amputation. It is at this point that Petipa experienced the onset of, in the words of his daughter Vera, a nervous illness and a skin condition. After 4 months of medical observation, he was diagnosed with pemphigus, a now treatable but then potentially fatal autoimmune disorder. Petipa thus withdrew from the project, remaining housebound for the entirety of the rehearsal process, but remained in constant correspondence with Ivanov, who still retained his choreographic plan as the layout for the subsequent ballet, with some modifications. It was with Ivanov that the failure or success of the ballet was largely to rest. Part 2. The character of Lev Ivanov and his works. Ivanov was, unlike Petipa, and perhaps to his disadvantage, a Russian native. Official policy tacitly favored the importation of foreign artists, not just in ballet, but in music as well. French ballet masters and Italian opera were, throughout much of the 19th century, preferred to any domestic offerings in Russia. Ivanov, born in 1834 and about 16 years Petipa's junior, grew up in the Imperial Theatre School, joining the Corps de Ballet in 1852. In 1882, through the intervention of Petipa, he was made regisseur of the company, a sort of equivalent to the modern balletmaster, overseeing the rehearsal of dances and the setting of ballets. He did not succeed in this office, being removed and then, through Petipa's influence again, made second balletmaster. When Petipa was away, Ivanov was effectively in charge as balletmaster. He found his appointment as regisseur in 1882, in his own words, most disquieting. The mild-mannered Ivanov was poorly suited to a post involving the rigid and dictatorial enforcement of a company discipline. As for his appointment as second balletmaster, he says, "It was not especially calm, but altogether better," end quote. While Ivanov is best remembered today for his lakeside scenes in Swan Lake and for his choreography in the Nutcracker, it should be remembered that choreography was not his primary task as second balletmaster. Choreography occupied very little of his official duties. The last 16 years of his life, he was mostly on the road, mounting the ballets of others abroad and in Moscow. He was extremely well liked by his colleagues. He was shy, reserved, and modest to a fault. About his own ballets, Ivanov states in his memoirs that he, quote, stages ballets no worse than other balletmasters, end quote. The 19th century ballet critic Alexander Plesheyev writes, quote, in the theatrical milieu there are few such people, cordial and attractive in their sincerity. This good man, who never had any secret or evil backstage schemes, stood apart from every other theatrical type. Artists loved him because, having lived to almost 70, he remained and died a colleague, a sincere colleague who recommended himself not in words, but in deeds. End quote. In Memoirs of a Petersburg ballerina, the Marinsky ballerina Ekaterina Vazem gives the following estimation of his character. Quote, a remarkably modest, undemanding, weak-willed, very good, mild, although occasionally irascible person, end quote. She could remember one time when, after making a mistake in a classical pas on stage in a way that was conspicuous and embarrassing to his partner, he attempted to kill himself with a revolver. He was also somewhat eccentric in both his mannerisms and dress. He was given to wearing rather bizarre khaki-green suits to the amusement of his colleagues. The prima ballerina Matilda Kashinskaya recounts with some dissatisfaction how, in class, he often preferred his violin to his duties as an instructor. Quote, in a lazy voice, he would tell us plié or genou en dehors, which means turn out, But he never stopped us, made no corrections, did not interrupt the class to point out a pupil's wrong movements." End quote. It should be said, however, that though untrained, he was a gifted violinist and had a remarkable ear for music. He could remember an entire ballet from a single hearing, as his colleague, character artist Alexander Shurayev attests. Quote, "Once, I recall, Anton Grigorovich Rubinstein played through his ballet The Grapevine in the rehearsal hall. The composer had hardly left the hall before Ivanov sat down at the piano and reproduced practically all of Rubinstein's music by ear." End quote. Despite his talent, his musicality would, in some places, falter. Shurayev himself acknowledged that Ivanov had confided to him that he didn't understand any of the music to the Spanish chants in the Nutcracker, a hardly problematical part of the entire ballet. Nonetheless, Ivanov's chief attraction lay in his choreography, for which he had a freshness and ingenuity unrivaled by even Petipa. He is described by Vazem as a true expert in ballet matters and in particular of classical dance. End quote. Unlike Petipa, however, he had difficulty sustaining such flashes of genius and originality over the length of an entire ballet. He was undisciplined and sometimes unfocused in rehearsal, as Shurayev suggests. Quote, "Lev Ivanov, on the advice of Petipa, prepared his dance productions at home. But, that said, with his very lazy nature, he often arrived unprepared at the theater. Then he willingly allowed individual artists not only to refashion this or that element, but also to mount complete dances. It seemed at times that he was even happy when someone came to his help. Modest and exceptionally kind by nature, Ivanov did not like to speak about himself. He never put his own goals first and gained nothing for himself personally. But on the other hand, it would happen that Ivanov would show such flashes of inventiveness, such originality of construction and movement. He would present something so vivid that you were simply surprised, not knowing where it came from." End quote. The peculiar genius of this peculiar man is laid out effectively by the Marinsky and Ballet Russe star Tamara Karsavina, who admired the, quote, "excellence and the beautifully organic structure of his choreography, which you could not divide into sections, as you could Petipa's brilliant adagios, but which had an inner cohesion, a continuous flow of movement." End quote. Karsavina's admiration is qualified somewhat, but still peers through this balanced but poignant assessment. Quote, "Had Ivanov's talent been given an unchecked course, could he have become a representative of an epoch such as Petipa had been? Perhaps not. His inspiration welled up richly, but it was undisciplined and moody. Artists coming into a rehearsal might find him playing the piano, improvising. He hardly noticed them and continued playing. Sometimes, becoming aware of their presence, he would get up from the piano and dismiss them. More often, though, in his creative mood fertile, he'd go on composing, keeping the artist beyond all reasonable time. It is doubtful if he would have left behind him anything like the consistent, highly polished output of Petipa, but he might have left to us many an unfading flower of poetic inspiration, deeper far and of broader vision. In his use of integrated dance as distinct from mere uncoordinated steps, he was the precursor of Fokine." End quote. Ultimately, it was to this gifted, though undisciplined genius that the Nutcracker and its collected problems were expected to find resolution. With that, I conclude today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully you'll join me next week when we look at parts 3 and 4, the choreography and critical reception of the first production of the Nutcracker. Thank you.